This is Whitley Strieber, and this is Dreamland. You have reached the edge of the world today. Life and death on Mars. John Brandenburg, Ph.D., mass extinction and nuclear catastrophe on Mars. John is a theoretical plasma and astrophysicist, and he and I go back for a long time. The original team that examined the Viking orbiter imagery from Mars, including the face on Mars, we were both part of it. I financed the only peer-reviewed examination of the Mars face by Dr. Mark Carlotto and Dr. Brian O'Leary. John was part of the original Internet Relay Chat group examining this that had been started by Dick Hoagland. Now, John's taken this a little farther, haven't you, John?
Yeah, well, I turned it into a scientific inquiry. The problem with analyzing images is that gets fairly subjective fairly quickly, especially if you don't have that much data. We had excellent data in Cydonia, and I think Dick Hoagland deserves a lot of credit for making that face almost as recognizable as George Washington on the dollar bill. But we had to, part of it happened was that Carl Sagan got in touch with me. And I ended up, my conversations with Carl we were two scientists, we ended up arguing about stuff like how long did Mars have liquid water? Was there time for, life to originate and evolve on Mars? What could we look for on Mars that would tell us one way or another if that was possible? There were two theories at the time as to what had caused Cydonia to look like an archaeological site. Dick's hypothesis was that it was spacefarers had come to Mars and set up a colony and arranged for the face to be there kind of as a beacon to attract the attention of other intelligent life, such as ourselves. Myself and Vince DiPietro favored the hypothesis that this was an indigenous culture that had an indigenous humanoid culture that had built these monuments, and that requires Mars to have had a biosphere for a long time, like Earth, to produce something like us.
Yes.
And so Carl and I basically went back and forth over what would be the evidence of such a long-lived Earth-like climate on Mars. And that I ended up going to conferences then and presenting papers and getting some nice scientific dialogue going on this. And I was in fact the first person to propose at a scientific conference the ocean of Mars, the Paleo Ocean of Mars.
Which is now pretty much an accepted reality.
I know, but they don't give me any credit.
Oh, no, they're not going to give you credit, John.
No, I'm radioactive because of Cydonia.
Right.
And we understand this.
Well,
royal we.
We're both radioactive.
We don't like it, but we understand it. It's good enough that people have actually picked up the idea, even if they don't give it any good attribution.
Right.
And but once you have an ocean on Mars, liquid water basically defines what we call the terrestrial environment. This requires a lot of things of Mars, and as we found, requiring an ocean that lived a long time. By the way, the fascinating thing about Mars is that the old ocean bed lies near Cydonia. Cydonia was basically the Riviera of Mars. And basically, that ocean is on the youngest part of Mars, not the old, heavily cratered part that looks like the moon. It's on the young region that's very smooth, has very few craters, meaning it's quite young geologically. because they use the number of craters per square mile as a way of telling time on Mars.
Right.
Assuming that they accumulated a uniform rate or something like a uniform rate over billions of years.
Right.
The region of Mars where Cydonia is the northern plains, or it's on the uplands just above what's called the 0 kilometer line, elevation line. And if you trace that line around Mars, it forms a perfect demarcation between the smooth lowlands and the upper, more rugged highlands. So it looks very much like that was an ocean basin. It was kind of a no-brainer. It's a testament to the conservative nature of Mars science that people didn't flag it before.
It is fundamentally very conservative Mars science. I think that the landers, the way the community has treated the landers' life experiment is an example of excessive conservatism.
And Whitley, as we can return to this a little bit later if you like, I think that all of searches for extraterrestrial life and intelligence are overshadowed by the UFO cover-up in our government.
Yeah, well,
it has a chilling effect on even the purest science. But part of the reason that Mars is they're so conservative on Mars is because of the question of extraterrestrial life and whether we're alone in the universe. If you go to the next Earth-like planet in the cosmos, which is Mars, which is, the most Earth-like of any planet in our solar system.
Right.
And if you find traces of even past life, this changes the equation completely. It means life is common in the universe.
Right.
And that raises so many immediate questions that the government does not want to answer. That they basically, by controlling who gets funded, they basically cultivate a school of very conservative people.
Right.
Who know the rules. They know they're not supposed to say the L word. In fact, you even pointed it out. You said that finding life on Mars would be death for JPL.
That's right. It would be because
that's a great quote.
Man, it would mean that there would be a public outcry for a manned mission to Mars.
That's right.
The trip that Brian O'Leary was so glad he never took.
That's right, and
he said to me,
they fear that like fire down in JPL.
Right, and they don't want that because that would mean that robotic exploration, which is what they're about, would be curtailed and its budget would be reduced. And the result is that JPL's culture, even without any pressure from anywhere else within the government, is very anti-finding life anywhere. So, I think that we have to look to the European missions if we're going to ever get any straight answers about life on Mars.
Well, you must remember that, all of the European nations who are going to Mars are part of NATO, and they are kind of wired into the whole thing, unfortunately.
That is unfortunate.
And especially because European scientists tend to be even more conservative than American scientists because of, basically, I think, because of World War II. They kind of lost confidence in themselves. They wait basically for the Americans or the Russians to do the same thing and then react to it.
Yeah, well, you say in your book, would a positive life sign not provoke troublesome questions to the government? Questions like, what are those lights in the sky at night?
That's right.
Right.
And I also compared it to a long Victorian romance, full of passionate letters and
right. Well, John,
sighing looks, but unfortunately, never any consummation.
When we come back with John Brandenburg, we're going to go into the past. Probably the real past. And we're going to see some very surprising things about Mars. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Dreamland. Serious wonder spoken here.
I'm having close encounters again. It started a few weeks ago, and it is getting to be very intense and deep, unlike anything that's happened to me in 30 years. Only this time it seems it's going to be happening with you in attendance, and I'm not nearly as confused about it as I was before. So keep listening to Dreamland. Next week I will be on with Timothy Hogan discussing a group of encounters that have happened over the past few weeks, and you can get ready for that by looking at my journal entry, Change of Being, which is the start of it. And then in the subscriber section, I'm going to be talking about something that took place last night. And I'm also going to be posting a new meditation, which is maybe the deepest one I've ever come to. So stay with us and stay with Dreamland. Things are changing here. It's not the same as it was. I am not the same. And if you're not a subscriber, the time is now to change from being a passive participant in this radio program and website and what it seeks to accomplish and become an active searcher. Do that by joining us. This is about awakening. You can't do it by just listening and sitting back passively waiting for things to change. Nothing's going to change. You have to become active. We're talking to astrophysicist John Brandenburg on the very beginning of the Mars controversy. John, when we first looked at the face on Mars staring up at us, I'm sure you felt the same sense of shock and amazement that I did. But then, when I believe that one of the more recent orbiters took an image of the same area, the face appeared to be just what NASA had claimed it would be, which was a tumble of essentially unrecognizable rocks. Now, I believe Mark Carlotto, the imaging scientist who worked with Brian. Yeah. Mark Carlotto told
brilliant guy.
Brilliant guy, yeah. Well, to give you folks a little bit of, and we'll have to have Mark on the show one of these days.
Yes, please do.
Mark, we had him on years ago, but before we had a subscriber section, and we'll have to have him on again. In any case, Mark told me he was the first person to really analyze the data from the Viking orbiter at a level of skill and with the equipment necessary to end up being able to publish a statistical analysis of it in the IEEE journal. So he knew this material very well, and he told me...
Really great article, by the way.
It's a great article, a very courageous article. He told me straight out. He said, after the new imagery came, he said, this has been altered. It's not... what's on the ground is not what was on the ground when the Viking orbiter took a picture.
They went to great lengths to make sure that first image that came out was mirror imaged. It was also taken from the side, and they deliberately reduced the contrast on it, so it looked like what we said, the cat box image. It looked like something in a cat box. I mean, very low contrast, a kitty litter box, to be more precise. It looked like a footprint in a snowbank. And the reason they did this, they waited until all of till it was almost filing time for all the reporters on the Pacific Coast, that they had to have something. So then they gave them one image, and the one image showed a oblique picture, almost a profile, with very low contrast, and was reversed left from right. So most people could not even tell what it was.
Right.
And they said, see, the face is gone. And if you look at the most recent images from everyone, they show the face straight down, and it's a face. It hasn't changed at all. But what they did was they made sure that the big moment, when they raised the curtain and the drum roll, that they showed an image that would confirm what everyone wanted to believe.
Right, especially the media, because the media has made a fundamental 60-year-long commitment that anything about life elsewhere is nonsense. This is the culture of the media. It's not necessarily what an individual reporter believes, but give you an example, the New York Times hasn't reported on any UFO material honestly since 1977 was their last truthful, or 76, their last truthful reports about any kind of UFO activity at all. And, you have to think that right before the Wright brothers flew, the New York Times published an article saying this business of heavier than air flight is nonsense, and we're going to just stop reporting it. They did not report the success of the Wright brothers for 2 years, not until they sold their technology to the French military. Was the New York Times willing even to mention it? That newspaper's culture has not changed an iota. It's still the same.
It's fascinating that they consider themselves an anti-establishment newspaper. They basically oppose whatever the powers that be are.
That's what they say for our benefit, but they are actually the establishment mouthpiece par excellence in the world.
Isn't that something?
Yeah. But let's go on now. Let's go back, if you will, John, to the Mars that you know and understand from so long ago. First, tell us, if you can, and I know it's hard, given us an estimate of about how long ago Mars was probably alive.
Probably about 500 million years ago. There weren't even cockroaches on this planet then. All we had was bacterial colonies.
Right.
And what's fascinating is just at the time when Mars apparently died, apparently due to a large asteroid impact about 500 miles to the northeast of Cydonia, called a Leo crater. It's spelled Liat. It's a French pronunciation, Leo, from a French astronomer. And this was a crater as big as Chicxulub that destroyed the dinosaurs, but it happened on Mars.
It's a much smaller planet.
It's a much smaller planet, and it's farther from the sun. And Mars needed an elaborate greenhouse to sustain the pressures and temperatures necessary to have a liquid ocean to sustain life. So Mars was a greenhouse in the Arctic, basically, and then a vandal came and threw a big rock through it, and it froze. Mars fell and could not get back up again. Unlike Earth, which was a larger planet closer to the sun, it had a Chicxulub impact, also had a Permian extinction, which was probably an asteroid impact, and 90% of everything that was alive died on Earth. However, the biosphere on Earth, even though it had a serious wound, was able to recover over time. It did change the whole path of evolution. Instead of having green scales and slit eyes, we have round eyes and hair on our heads. This is probably what happened. But on Mars, the event was so devastating that the ocean froze, the CO2 greenhouse collapsed, and the first person to figure out that this was possible was Carl Sagan.
Right.
That was the fascinating. Every time we think we found that we were exploring strange new parts of the forest, we'd find a mark on a tree saying Carl Sagan was here. So
yes.
He was far more brilliant a planetary scientist than people give him credit for.
Oh yeah, he was a real pioneer.
He was.
I met Carl Sagan once, and I knew Faith Hubley, the lady who had virtually raised him, very well. We were close friends. I don't know if you ever met Faith. And
no, I unfortunately never did.
But I had brief conversation with Carl about this outside of the context of any kind of a social situation, let's say. And I said to him, frankly, I said, I think that I had already published Communion at that point.
Yeah.
And he was having difficulty even being polite about it. And I said, look, it isn't necessarily about aliens he was talking about how impossible it would be to travel across space because of the barriers to how slow light speed actually is.
That's right. Yeah, it's the law. You can't travel faster than light.
And he was saying that it would take so long and require such an enormous amount of energy. How could it ever possibly be done? And I said something to the effect, of course, Carl, within 100 years ago, radio was absolute magic. The idea of it was complete nonsense. But I said, there's another issue. That is, what if they didn't come from another world at all? What if their reference to our world is entirely different and unexpected? And he stared at me. He almost went white. And I said, you do know. And that's where the conversation abruptly ended. He knew something about the truth of it. I don't know what it was, but he knew the truth of it.
I have heard that he, in his early years as a scientist, he predicted the greenhouse effect on Venus, that Venus would be hot enough to bake cookies on.
He certainly did, but it turned out to be a little hotter even than that.
That's right. It was a little bit hotter. It would burn the cookies. But what he did, so he was kind of, and you know how well-spoken he was.
Very.
I was fortunate to meet him a few times and talk with him, and we actually had several cordial conversations, and he was extremely cordial to Vince DiPietro, and talked with him for a while, to apparently the great anger of other members of the Planetary Society.
They were not very pleasant.
No, they were.
Vince DiPietro at all, no.
No, but anyway, Vince and him actually had this very animated conversation off in a corner at the Smithsonian Institute one night when they were having some gala event, and it was a Mars conference or something, and I introduced them, and then they kind of shuffled off to a corner and were talking, and they seemed to be really enjoying themselves, and I decided, this is their moment. But what I've heard, and of course these are just reports, no one can verify them, is that Carl very quickly realized the same thing that Fermi realized. The question of where the hell are they? Where is the intelligent life that seems like it should abound in this universe? And he began asking questions, and he was basically taken aside and told, "Don't ask certain questions. Play along with us." And of course, he went on to be one of the most prominent spokesmen to popularize interest in the cosmos.
Yes, he did.
Great theory, cosmos, was immensely valuable to me in getting me to be a space cadet, which I am nowadays.
Listen, we need to get back to Mars here.
Absolutely.
Because
Let's get back to Mars.
You and I could talk about Carl for hours.
Oh, yes.
And I'm sure the listeners
God rest his soul.
God rest his soul, are fascinated with his inside information about Carl. And I mean, we could talk about negotiating Washington for hours, which I know we have consulted about that before from time to time.
That's right.
But let's instead talk about Mars. There was on that original Internet Relay chat an amazing message from you.
Yes.
It started out with the phrase, "Mars was murdered." And when
I posed it as a question. Was Mars murdered?
Was Mars murdered? Now, when we get back, folks, we're going to get into just what John meant. We'll be right back. You think that what subscribers to UnknownCountry.com get is just an archive or a rehash of what you can hear for free? Not quite true. Listen to this.
The Indonesian doctor is writing an article in the 1980s. This is more than 10 years after the mysterious German doctor has died. And now he's writing his recollections of that whole episode. And one of his recollections was that there was a small boy at one time when he first met the doctor in the island of Sumbawa. There was a small American boy living with him.
And that small American boy turns out to have the same name as a serial killer in the United States who was obsessed with Hitler, who was the right age, and who was executed in 2010. Listen to this in the subscriber section. It is quite incredible, as is so much of the additional information that we offer. So come on and join us. Join the fun. Join the enlightenment. Get the information. Go to unknowncountry.com and subscribe. It's just $12.95 for 3 wonderful months.
Ann Strieber was overweight, 100 pounds overweight. She tried diet after diet, but nothing worked. Then she discovered an extraordinary secret and took that 100 pounds off and kept it off. In her new ebook, What I Learned from the Fat Years, she tells you exactly how to really take off weight and how to keep it off. All kinds of great hints, plus a deep understanding of how diets actually work and why they work. What I Learned from the Fat Years. Diet Wisdom from Ann Strieber. Get it from the unknowncountry.com store. Go to unknowncountry.com and download your copy today.
Plus, there's a nice price break on Fat Years from $4.99 to $2.99, so get it now.
The key, the mystery, the wonder. Now in a powerful new edition from Tarcher Penguin, Whitley Strieber updates the thrilling story with new revelations. Even the master of the key's most incredible predictions are coming true. We've discovered that there are many universes besides our own. He predicted this in 1998. He described how intelligent machines could be built. We're doing it now. If you love the key, you need this new edition. And if you've never read it before, don't miss this beautiful book filled with true wisdom and true revelations. The key is unique in this world. Graham Hancock says, consider its messages and you'll find it has worked a kind of magic on you. The Key. A selection of the Quality Paperback Book Club, the Book of the Month Club, and the One Spirit Book Club. Available in bookstores everywhere and online in all e-book format.
Get your copy with an autographed Whitley Strieber Collection bookplate from the unknowncountry.com store. We're talking to astrophysicist John Brandenburg, one of the original examiners of the Cydonia face and the Cydonia material on Mars. He has evolved some extraordinary and powerful ideas about what was really going on there. We've already heard that NASA has made an effort to obscure the fact that the face is still there.
Yes.
Now, John, back when we were originally involved in the original Internet Relay Chat, and this was back in 1985, folks, John posed the question, was Mars murdered? I have never forgotten that post. It haunts me to this day. John, what have you learned about what happened to Mars?
Well, what had happened when I raised that question was I was studying, we were of course studying the face and the other objects such as the D&M pyramid in Cydonia and the other objects that look artificial, looks like eroded archaeology. Then what had happened, we were delving deeply into how can we explain this. To us, to Vince DiPietro and I, the simplest hypothesis was that Mars was like Earth in the past. So we were looking at a whole range of scientific data gathered by the Viking expedition, not just the pictures, but also, sampling of the atmosphere, sampling of the soil, and we found a real anomaly, and that was that the xenon-129 in the atmosphere was incredibly elevated over any other sample. I mean, you can sample the solar wind, and there 129 and 132, the two main isotopes of xenon, are the same. And xenon has like 5 stable isotopes, so it has a nice fingerprint.
Right.
processes. So you sample the solar wind, you sample xenon from meteorites. It's all xenon 129, 132 are in balance. You sample Earth's atmosphere, it's in balance. And you sample like Jupiter's, and apparently it's in balance. So you have all of these, and also Venus. So you have all of these samples from around the solar system, but you sample Mars, the xenon 129 is 2.5 times the level of xenon 132. And this, when I showed this to some nuclear weapons specialists that I was working with, one of them just said, "Oh my God, it looks like there was a big explosion there." And
nuclear
it took
explosion.
a while to find out, but you find out when you delve into secrets on Mars, you start running into secrets on Earth. Xenon 129 is produced in 2 types of explosions. One is supernova, and the other is nuclear weapons explosions. It's a fingerprint. It's the gun smoke of a violent, fast nuclear process. It doesn't even get made in nuclear reactors very much. It's only in a nuclear explosion, like a hydrogen bomb, an atomic bomb. And it took me a while to figure out that even though this was in the open literature, it was considered one of the things that one of the cards Uncle Sammy keeps close to the chest, because
Right.
they monitor the xenon 129 in the atmosphere all the time to see if anyone's setting off nukes.
Right.
Secretly. Like South Africa did down near the South Pole. There was a big flash one day.
Oh, I remember that very well. Yeah, absolutely.
That's right. And the South African government said it was just a sighting of Venus.
Right, exactly. They were amusing themselves at the expense of the U.S. government.
They were.
And the question of whether that was an Israeli nuclear test, a South African nuclear test, or a joint Israeli-South African nuclear test has never been publicly resolved.
No, I think it was a joint test. And, but they, one of the ways they find out if something like that has occurred, when no one was looking, was to monitor the atmosphere, and as it turns out, there's the xenon 129 in our atmosphere has changed very slightly since 1945, and that's because of new open-air nuclear testing. And once I kind of figured out that that's what it was, and then I kind of looked around, I realized, no, there is not any real literature on this.
Yeah, none that you can read anyway.
None that I can read. So we found out that the xenon 129 in the Martian atmosphere is indicative of a very large, very violent nuclear explosion. And
John,
you kind of have only 2 ways that could happen.
Yeah, go ahead.
One plausible way, which I did get to a scientific conference and propose, was that there was a large natural nuclear reactor on Mars that went unstable and kind of did a Chernobyl. The other is that it was an airburst from outside of Mars. It was a technological thing. And the only problem with the large nuclear reactor problem is that this occurred on Earth. There were natural nuclear reactors on Earth operating in Africa. There's every reason to believe they could have happened on Mars. However, this one would have had to have been very large and gone violently unstable, and it left no crater because
there's nothing on Mars that would suggest the existence of such a thing, and yet it would have left a very substantial mark.
Absolutely.
Unlike an airburst.
The gamma ray maps of Mars in thorium and potassium, and you can look them up on the internet, and they're in the color section of the book, show a big red spot of activity, heightened activity. And this one turns out to be about 500 miles to the west of Cydonia.
So, John, you're saying that in the past there was a nuclear explosion on Mars, and you're a man who is in a position to know because of your scientific training. Now, that suggests it was technological, that this was a mechanical device that exploded, not something natural. That's incredible, appalling. We have reached the end of Dreamland, however, but we'll go on. We're going to continue on with this in the subscriber discussion with John Brandenburg and find out just what he thinks happened and when, back in the distant past. John Brandenburg's terrific book, Life and Death on Mars, the new Mars synthesis, available from Amazon, from BN.com, in your local bookstores. Don't miss it. It is really very, very enlightening. John Brandenburg, thank you so much for being with us on Dreamland.
You've been listening to Dreamland. Be sure to tune in again next week. Dreamland is brought to you by UnknownCountry.com and our family of subscribers. Our news editor is Ann Strieber. Our science reporter is Linda Bolton Howe. Our webmaster is Daniel Stiegel. And I'm your Dreamland announcer, Brian Arnold. Thanks for listening. We'll be back next week.
And presenting papers and getting some nice, scientific dialogue going on this. And I was, in fact, the first person to propose at a scientific conference the ocean of Mars, the Paleo Ocean of Mars.
Which is now pretty much an accepted reality.
I know, but they don't give me any credit. It's
oh, no, they're not going to give you credit, John.
No, I'm radioactive because of Cydonia.
Right.
And we understand this.
Well,
royal we.
We're both radioactive.
We don't like it, but we understand it. It's good enough that people have actually picked up the idea, even if they don't give it any good attribution.
Right.
And but once you have an ocean on Mars, liquid water, basically, hypothesis was that it was spacefarers had come to Mars and set up a colony and arranged for the face to be there kind of as a beacon to attract the attention of other intelligent life, such as ourselves. Myself and Vince DiPietro favored the hypothesis that this was an indigenous culture that had an indigenous humanoid culture that had built these monuments, and that requires Mars to have had a biosphere for a long time, like Earth, to produce something like us.
Yes.
And so Carl and I basically went back and forth over what would be the evidence of such a long-lived Earth-like climate on Mars. And that I ended up going to conferences then and
part of it. I financed the only peer-reviewed examination of the Mars face by Dr. Mark Carlotto and Dr. Brian O'Leary. John was part of the original Internet Relay Chat group examining this that had been started by Dick Hoagland. Now, John's taken this a little farther, haven't you, John?
Yeah, well, I turned it into a scientific inquiry. The problem with analyzing images is that gets fairly subjective fairly quickly, especially if you don't have that much data. We had excellent data in Cydonia, and I think Dick Hoagland deserves a lot of credit for making that face almost as recognizable as George Washington on the dollar bill. But we had to, part of it happened was that Carl Sagan got in touch with me. And I ended up, my conversations with Carl we were two scientists, we ended up arguing about stuff like, how long did Mars have liquid water? Was there time for, life to originate and evolve on Mars? What could we look for on Mars that would tell us one way or another if that was possible? There were two theories at the time as to what had caused Cydonia to look like an archaeological site. Dick's proposal
This is Whitley Strieber, and this is Dreamland. You have reached the edge of the world today. Life and death on Mars. John Brandenburg, Ph.D., mass extinction and nuclear catastrophe on Mars. John is a theoretical plasma and astrophysicist, and he and I go back for a long time. The original team that examined the Viking orbiter imagery from Mars, including the face on Mars. We were both